in the frozen February of 1316, when famine gripped England like a vice and mother's milk became more valuable than gold. A young woman named Beatrice faced a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her days. Good evening, dear friend. As you rest tonight in the comfort and safety of your bed, I invite you to journey with me into a time when survival demands sacrifices we can barely imagine. This is a story that asks difficult questions about love and duty, about what we owe to our children and what we owe to ourselves, about the impossible choices poverty forces upon us. It is not an easy story, but it is an honest one, told with compassion for those who lived in times far harsher than our own. Let the tensions of your day fall away as we walk together through this tale of resilience, and may you find in it not despair, but rather a deep appreciation for the strength of the human heart, even when it must break to keep beating. Her name was Beatrice Miller, and in the early spring of 1316, she was 23 years old and desperate in ways she'd never imagined possible. She had the kind of beauty that poverty tried to erase but couldn't quite manage. High cheekbones that caught the light, eyes the color of honey in sunlight, and hair that, when clean and brushed, fell in waves of dark amber to her waist. But beauty meant little when your stomach was empty, and your baby was crying from hunger you couldn't satisfy. She lived in the village of Ashford in the county of Kent, in southeastern England. Though lived was perhaps too generous a word for the existence she and her husband John barely maintained in a one-room cottage that leaked when it rained and let in drafts from every direction. The cottage sat at the edge of the village, near the mill where John worked when there was work to be had, which was increasingly rare in these troubled times. The year 1316 was the second year of what would later be called the Great Famine, though those living through it had no way of knowing it would last 7 years, or that it would kill perhaps 10% of Northern Europe's population. All Beatrice knew was that the rains had come in the spring of 1315 and never seemed to stop, turning fields into swamps, rotting grain in the ground, drowning animals in their pens. The harvest that year had been catastrophic, and the winter that followed had been brutal. Now, in early 1316, food stores were depleted. Prices were astronomical when food could be found at all, and people were beginning to die. First the old, then the very young, then anyone whose body was already weakened by years of marginal nutrition. Beatrice's daughter, Eleanor, had been born in December, in the coldest part of that terrible winter. She'd arrived a month early, small and struggling, and for the first weeks of her life, Beatrice had been terrified she wouldn't survive. But Eleanor had proven tougher than she looked, clinging to life with a determination that reminded Beatrice of her own mother, who'd raised 6 children through various hardships before dying of a fever 3 years ago. For the first 2 months, Beatrice's milk had come in abundant and rich despite her own poor nutrition. This was a mercy she hadn't expected, her body somehow managing to provide for Eleanor even when Beatrice herself was half-starved. She nursed her daughter constantly, feeling the fierce joy of being able to give her child what she needed, even if it meant Beatrice herself grew thinner, weaker, more hollow-eyed with each passing week. John did what he could. He was a good man, steady and kind, with broad shoulders and calloused hands, and a laugh that had once come easily but now seemed to have deserted him entirely. He was 26, just 3 years older than Beatrice, but the famine had aged him, carved lines into his face that made him look 40. He'd been working at the mill since he was 12, learning the trade from his father, who died 2 years ago in an accident, crushed beneath a millstone that had come loose from its mounting. John had inherited his father's position, but not his security. The mill owner, Master Robert, was struggling like everyone else, and there was less grain to grind, which meant less work, which meant less pay. They survived on what John could earn, supplemented by what Beatrice could glean from the fields after harvest, though there'd been so little to harvest that gleaning yielded almost nothing. They ate pottage made from whatever they could find: turnips, old cabbage, the last withered apples from the previous autumn, sometimes a handful of barley or oats when John was paid in grain, instead of the increasingly worthless pennies that bought less and less. They ate bread when they could afford it, though bread prices had tripled since the famine began. They didn't eat meat except on the rare occasions when John managed to trap a rabbit, and even then, most of it went to make broth that would stretch further. Eleanor thrived for those first 2 months, growing plump on her mother's milk, her cheeks rounding out, her tiny body gaining weight. Beatrice would lie beside her daughter in the night, watching her sleep, marveling at the perfection of her. The tiny fingers, the miniature toes, the way her mouth made sucking motions even in sleep. This was her daughter, her miracle, the thing she'd wanted most in the world after 3 years of marriage during which she'd begun to fear she was barren. But then, in late February, everything changed. It started with a visitor, Lady Margaret Thornbury, wife of Sir William Thornbury, who owned most of the land around Ashford and lived in the manor house that dominated the village from its position on a low hill. Lady Margaret was perhaps 30 years old, though she looked younger, with the kind of beauty that came from good nutrition and a life free from physical labor. She had pale skin that had never been weathered by outdoor work, dark hair elaborately braided and covered with a fine linen wimple, and clothes made from wool so fine it seemed to glow. Beatrice had seen Lady Margaret from a distance many times but had never spoken to her directly. The nobility and the peasantry inhabited the same villages but lived in different worlds, their paths crossing only in church or during the manor court sessions when tenants had to pay their rents and fees. So when Lady Margaret appeared at Beatrice's cottage door one cold February afternoon, accompanied by her maidservant Agnes, Beatrice was so startled she nearly dropped the distaff she'd been using to spin wool. "Are you Beatrice Miller?" Lady Margaret asked. Her voice was cultured, the accent marking her as someone educated, someone who'd been taught to speak properly rather than just picking up the local dialect. "Yes, my lady," Beatrice said, curtsying awkwardly, aware of how shabby she must look in her patched dress and worn apron, her hair covered by a kerchief that had once been white but was now an indeterminate gray. "I'm told you recently had a child." "A daughter," Lady Margaret's eyes swept the small cottage and landed on Eleanor, who lay sleeping in a rough wooden cradle near the fire. "Yes, my lady. Eleanor. She's 10 weeks old. And you're nursing her yourself." The question seemed odd, but Beatrice answered honestly. "Yes, my lady. My milk came in well, thanks be to God." Something flickered across Lady Margaret's face, relief, or perhaps calculation. "I need a wet nurse," she said directly. "I gave birth to a son 6 weeks ago. My milk failed after only 2 weeks, and the wet nurse we'd engaged died of fever 3 days ago. The baby needs someone immediately, and I'm told you have an abundance of milk." Beatrice felt the world tilt slightly. A wet nurse, of course. It was a common enough arrangement. Wealthy women often hired poorer women to nurse their bobbies, either because they couldn't produce milk themselves, or because nursing was considered beneath their dignity, or because they needed to be free for another pregnancy to produce the requisite heir and spare. Wet nursing was one of the few ways a peasant woman could earn significant money, and the pay was usually good, far better than what most women could earn through any other work available to them. But it would mean nursing Lady Margaret's son. It would mean her milk that was currently nourishing Eleanor, would go to a noble baby instead. And there was no way Beatrice could produce enough milk for 2 bobbies, not with how little she was eating herself. "My lady, I'm honored that you'd consider me, but I have my own daughter to think of," Beatrice began. "You'd be well paid," Lady Margaret interrupted. 2 shillings a week, plus room and board at the manor. That's more than your husband earns in a month at the mill, I'd wager. And in these times, such money could mean the difference between survival and starvation for your family. 2 shillings a week. The sum was staggering. John typically earned about 3 shillings a month when work was steady, and work hadn't been steady in over a year. 2 shillings a week for perhaps 6 months or more of wet nursing would be a fortune to a family like theirs. It could mean buying food, repairing their cottage, even putting aside savings against future hardship. But Eleanor. What about Eleanor? "I would need to continue nursing my own daughter as well," Beatrice said carefully. "I couldn't just." "The arrangement is exclusive," Lady Margaret said firmly. "My son requires all of your attention and all of your milk. You would live at the manor during the nursing period. You could visit your daughter once a week, on Sundays after church. Your husband would care for her during the week." Beatrice felt something cold settle in her stomach. "But my lady, she's only 10 weeks old. She needs her mother. She needs my milk. Your husband can feed her pap, bread soaked in milk or water. Many bobbies are raised that way when their mothers die in childbirth. It's not ideal, but it's survivable. And the money you'd earn could ensure she survives the famine, could give her a future." Lady Margaret's voice softened slightly. "I understand this is difficult, but these are difficult times. We all must make hard choices." The word survivable echoed in Beatrice's mind. Not thrive or flourish, but merely survive. At 10 weeks old, Eleanor would be switched from her mother's abundant milk to pap, a poor substitute that was hard to digest, that didn't provide nearly the same nutrition that many bobbies failed to tolerate well. The mortality rate for bobbies raised on pap rather than breast milk was high. Beatrice knew this. Everyone knew this. But in a famine, when mothers were dying or their milk was drying up from malnutrition, pap was often the only option. Could I think about it? Beatrice asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Could I discuss it with my husband? Lady Margaret's expression suggested this was already more negotiation than she'd expected to engage in. I need an answer by tomorrow morning. My son cannot wait long. He's already weakened from 3 days of inadequate feeding. If you decline, I'll have to find another wet nurse, and there aren't many women in the village who have sufficient milk these days. But I'm told yours is particularly abundant, that your daughter is thriving. That's what I need for my son. After Lady Margaret left, Beatrice sat on the floor beside Eleanor's cradle, tears streaming down her face. The baby was awake now, watching her mother with those serious dark eyes that seemed to see more than a 10-week-old should be able to see. Beatrice picked her up, held her close, felt the warm weight of her, breathed in that distinctive baby smell, milk and innocence and something indefinably sweet. I don't know what to do, she whispered to her daughter. I don't know what's right. When John came home that evening, exhausted from a long day at the mill where there'd been barely any work, Beatrice told him about Lady Margaret's offer. They sat together at their rough wooden table, a single tallow candle flickering between them, casting shadows that made the small cottage feel even smaller, more confining. 2 shillings a week, John repeated, his voice filled with wonder and something else, hope perhaps or temptation. Beatrice, that's more money than I could earn in months. Maybe years, the way things are going. But Eleanor, Beatrice said, she'd have to be weaned onto pap. She's so young, John. Too young. John was quiet for a long time, staring at the candle flame. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was heavy with the weight of their circumstances. I need to tell you something I've been trying not to say. Master Robert told me yesterday that he's cutting hours at the mill. There's just not enough grain coming in. Starting next week, I'll only be working 2 days a week instead of 5. That's less than 1 shilling a week if I'm lucky. The cold that had been sitting in Beatrice's stomach since Lady Margaret's visit turned to ice. Less than 1 shilling a week. They couldn't survive on that. They were barely surviving as it was. We're going to starve, John continued, and there were tears in his eyes now. This strong man who never cried, who'd stayed stoic through his father's death and the loss of 2 stillborn bobbies before Eleanor. All 3 of us. Unless something changes, we're going to starve. And if we starve, Eleanor dies anyway. At least this way we have a chance. You'd be at the manor, eating well, producing milk. I'd use the money to buy food for Eleanor and myself. We'd survive. And in 6 months or so, when the nursing contract ends, we'd be together again, with enough savings to get through whatever comes next. But what if she dies while I'm gone? Beatrice asked, her voice breaking. What if the pap doesn't agree with her, or she gets sick, or she just gives up because her mother abandoned her? You wouldn't be abandoning her, John said fiercely. You'd be saving her. You'd be doing what mothers have to do, making the hard choice, sacrificing your own wants for your child's needs. She needs to survive the famine, B. That's what matters. Not whether she is breast milk or pap, not whether her mother is with her every day, just survival. That's all any of us can hope for right now. They talked deep into the night, going round and round, weighing options that all seemed impossible. Keep Eleanor with her, and watch all three of them slowly starve. Send Eleanor to a wet nurse for Lady Margaret, and hope that Eleanor could survive on Pap and John's care. There was no good choice, only choices with different types of pain attached. Finally, as the candle burned low and Eleanor began to fuss for her night feeding, Beatrice made her decision. I'll do it, she said, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. I'll tell Lady Margaret tomorrow that I'll be her wet nurse. But John, you have to promise me you'll take good care of Eleanor. Feed her the pap with goat's milk if you can get it, not just water. Keep her warm, hold her. Don't let her think she's unloved just because her mother isn't there. I promise, John said solemnly. I swear it on my father's grave. I'll care for her as if she were made of spun glass. And B, you'll see her every Sunday. You'll still be her mother. This isn't forever. Just until we get through the worst of it. Beatrice nursed Eleanor that night, crying silently as her daughter suckled, storing up the memory of this closeness, this bond, against the separation to come. She memorized everything, the way Eleanor's tiny hand gripped her finger, the small sounds she made while nursing, the way her eyes would slowly close as her belly filled, the weight of her in Beatrice's arms. This was her daughter, her heart made flesh, and tomorrow she would begin the process of giving her up, at least temporarily. She told herself it was for Eleanor's good. She told herself John was right, that this was about survival, not about love. She told herself that in 6 months or a year, when the nursing contract ended and she had money saved, and perhaps the famine had eased, they'd be reunited and everything would be fine. But deep down, in a place she didn't want to examine too closely, she wondered if she was making a terrible mistake. She wondered if Eleanor would forgive her. She wondered if she'd forgive herself. The next morning, Beatrice walked to the manor house, an imposing stone structure that seemed to mock the poverty of the village below it. She was shown into a parlor that was warmer and more comfortable than any room she'd ever been in, with tapestries on the walls and cushioned chairs and actual glass in the windows. Lady Margaret received her there, along with Agnes the maidservant and an older woman introduced as Mistress Hilda, who served as the manor's housekeeper. "I'll accept your offer, my lady," Beatrice said, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. "I'll wet nurse your son." Relief flooded Lady Margaret's face. "Excellent," You can begin immediately. Agnes will show you to your room. You'll have a private chamber near the nursery. Your duties will be to nurse my son on demand, day and night, and to care for him between feedings as needed. You'll eat with the household servants and will be provided with adequate food to maintain your milk supply. You may visit your family on Sundays after church, but you must return by evening. Do you understand? Yes, my lady. One more thing, Lady Margaret said, and something in her tone made Beatrice look up sharply. You are to cease nursing your own child immediately. I cannot have you dividing your milk between two bobbies. My son must have all of it. Is that clear? But my lady, I nursed her just last night. Then that was her last feeding from you, Lady Margaret said firmly. Your milk now belongs to my son. Your husband will care for your daughter using other means. That was the arrangement. Beatrice wanted to argue, wanted to explain that weaning couldn't happen overnight, that her breasts would be painful and engorged if Alina stopped nursing suddenly, that the baby would be distressed and confused. But she could see in Lady Margaret's face that argument was useless. This was the deal, take it or leave it. I understand, my lady, Beatrice whispered. She was taken to meet the baby, Lord William's son and heir, christened Robert after his grandfather. He was 6 weeks old, smaller than Alina had been at that age, with a pinched face and a cry that sounded weak and desperate. When they placed him in Beatrice's arms and he began to root for her breast, her body responded automatically, her milk letting down, and she felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Pity for this hungry baby who needed her, guilt that she was about to feed him while her own daughter went hungry, and beneath it all, a deep, aching grief for the loss of the intimate bond she'd had with Alina. But she was a mother, and mothers did what needed to be done. She settled into the comfortable chair they'd provided, unlaced her bodice, and guided little Robert to her breast. He latched on desperately, suckling hard, and Beatrice felt her milk flow into him, giving him life, giving him strength. All while Alina, in her cold cottage at the edge of the village, cried for a mother who didn't come. John did his best. Beatrice knew he did. When she visited on that first Sunday, walking the short distance from the manor to her cottage after church, she found him red-eyed and exhausted, bouncing Alina in his arms while she wailed inconsolably. He'd been trying to feed her pap made from bread soaked in water. They couldn't afford milk. Not yet. Not until Lady Margaret paid Beatrice her first week's wages. She won't take it, John said desperately. She just spits it out and cries for you. I've tried everything, Bea. I don't know what else to do. Beatrice took her daughter, and Alina immediately began rooting at her chest, searching for milk that Beatrice could no longer give her. The pain of it, physical and emotional, was almost unbearable. Her breasts were full, aching with milk meant for little Robert, milk that Alina desperately needed, but the contract forbade it. Lady Margaret had been explicit. All the milk belonged to her son. You have to keep trying with the app, Beatrice told John, forcing herself to sound confident even though she felt anything but. She'll take it eventually when she gets hungry enough. Bobbies are resilient. She'll adapt. But would she? Eleanor was already looking thinner, her cheeks less plump, her eyes sunken in a way that terrified Beatrice. 1 week, and already her daughter was suffering. Beatrice stayed as long as she could, holding Eleanor, singing to her, trying to comfort her without feeding her. When she finally had to return to the manor, leaving her sobbing daughter in John's arms, she felt like she was tearing her own heart out of her chest. The second week was worse. Eleanor had begun taking the pap, but not enough. She was losing weight, becoming listless. John was beside himself with worry, but also with exhaustion. He was trying to work his reduced hours at the mill while also caring for a baby who cried constantly, who wouldn't sleep, who seemed to be fatting before his eyes. The money, Beatrice reminded him desperately. Use the money I'm earning to buy milk. Goat's milk, cow's milk, anything. The app will be better with milk than with just water. I'm trying, John said. But milk is expensive, B. And there's not much to be had. Everyone's struggling. The animals are dying from the cold and lack of fodder. By the 3rd week, Eleanor had developed a cough. By the 4th, she had a fever. Beatrice held her during her Sunday visit, feeling the heat radiating from her small body, hearing the rattling in her chest, and knew with a mother's instinct that something was terribly wrong. She needs help, Beatrice told John urgently. She needs a physician, or at least the village healer. Mistress Joan might know what herbs could help. Mistress Joan wants payment, John said bitterly. Everything costs money we don't have. I'm trying to buy milk, buy food, keep the fire going so she stays warm. There's nothing left for physicians or healers. Then use my wages. I am using your wages. Every penny of it. But it's not enough, B. Nothing is enough. They were trapped in an impossible situation, a cycle of poverty and desperation that the famine had created and that Beatrice's wet nursing contract, meant to solve, had somehow made it worse. She was eating well at the manor, her body producing abundant milk for little Robert, who was thriving under her care. Meanwhile, her own daughter was wasting away, slowly dying while Beatrice stood helpless. On the 5th Sunday, Beatrice made a decision that would haunt her forever. She would nurse Eleanor, just once, just enough to give her some strength, some nutrition beyond the inadequate pap. Lady Margaret wouldn't know. Beatrice would be careful, would make sure little Robert was fully fed before she left for her Sunday visit, would rush back to feed him again before he got too hungry. It would be fine. It had to be fine. She unlaced her bodice in the cold cottage, ignoring John's surprised look, and guided Eleanor to her breast. The baby, now nearly 4 months old and weak from illness and malnutrition, latched on with desperate hunger. Beatrice felt her milk let down, felt it flowing into her daughter, and closed her eyes against the tears. This was right. This was what she should have been doing all along. Her milk belonged to Eleanor, not to some noble baby whose mother had more resources, more options, more everything than Beatrice would ever have. For these few precious minutes, she was Eleanor's mother again, not just a milk source for hire. But when she returned to the manor, she found Lady Margaret waiting for her, her face cold with fury. "You nursed your daughter," she said flatly. It wasn't a question. Beatrice's blood turned to ice. "How did you?" "Robert was hungry an hour after you left, and your breasts weren't full enough to satisfy him properly. It's obvious what you did." Lady Margaret's voice was sharp as a knife. "You violated the terms of our contract. Your milk belongs to my son, all of it. Not to your daughter." "My lady, please, she's sick, she's dying. And my son nearly died before you came." Lady Margaret's composure cracked, revealing the fear beneath. "Do you think I enjoy this arrangement? Do you think I wanted to hire a wet nurse? I wanted to feed my own child, but my body failed me, and now his life depends on you. On your milk, your dedication. If you cannot give him what he needs, I'll find someone who can." The threat was clear. Beatrice would lose the position, lose the income, lose everything they'd sacrificed Eleanor's well-being to gain. "It won't happen again," Beatrice whispered, defeated. "I swear it, my lady. It won't happen again." But the damage was done. That unauthorized nursing session had given Eleanor just enough strength to linger, but not enough to truly recover. She continued to waste away through February and into March, her small body fighting a battle it was slowly losing. On a cold March morning, 3 months after Beatrice had become a wet nurse to little Robert Thornberry, John came to the manor house. Beatrice knew as soon as she saw his face what had happened. Eleanor had died in the night, just stopped breathing, slipped away in her sleep. She was 4.5 months old. Beatrice's scream shattered the morning quiet of the manor. She tried to run to her cottage, to her daughter, but Lady Margaret's servants held her back, told her she needed to feed Robert first, that the baby was crying, that her duty was here. Her duty, her contract. The money they'd needed so desperately, that was supposed to save them all. She fed Robert, her tears falling on his innocent face as he nursed, and hated herself, hated him, hated Lady Margaret and the famine and the unfair world that forced mothers to choose between their children's lives. They buried Eleanor in the churchyard, in a tiny grave that seemed impossibly small. Father Matthew spoke words about God's mercy and eternal rest, but Beatrice heard none of it. She stood beside John, both of them hollow-eyed and destroyed, and wondered if either of them would ever be whole again. The contract still had 3 months to run. Beatrice considered breaking it, walking away, but what would that accomplish? Eleanor was gone. The money would at least ensure she and John didn't starve, and would give them something to show for their daughter's death beyond grief and guilt. So she stayed. She continued nursing little Robert, watching him grow strong and healthy on milk that should have gone to Eleanor. She did her duty, fulfilled her contract, and earned her wages. And every night, alone in her comfortable room at the manor, she wept for the daughter she'd sacrificed in the name of survival. The weeks that followed Eleanor's death existed in a gray fog that Beatrice moved through like a ghost. She performed her duties mechanically, nursing Robert when he cried, caring for him between feedings, eating the meals the manor servants provided. Her body continued to produce milk in abundance, responding to the demand regardless of what her heart felt. But inside, she was hollow, scraped clean of everything except guilt and grief. Lady Margaret, to her credit, showed an awkward sort of compassion. She didn't speak of Alina directly, but she gave Beatrice 3 days of rest after the burial, during which another servant handled most of Robert's care, while Beatrice was allowed to simply exist in her grief. On the 4th day, when Beatrice returned to her duties, Lady Margaret said only, "I'm sorry for your loss. I know this arrangement will cost you dearly." The words were inadequate, but they were also sincere, and Beatrice found herself nodding in acknowledgement. Lady Margaret hadn't created the famine, hadn't invented the economic system that made wet nursing necessary, and hadn't personally killed Alina. She'd simply been another person trying to save her child in impossible times. It was easier to hate her than to hate the faceless forces of weather and hunger and circumstance, but Beatrice was too exhausted for hate. There was only grief and the grinding necessity of continuing to live. John visited her on Sundays now, making the walk to the manor since there was no longer any reason for Beatrice to return to the cottage. They would sit together in a quiet corner of the manor's gardens when weather permitted, or in the servants' hall when it wasn't, and try to find words for what they were feeling. But words seemed inadequate for the enormity of their loss. "I keep thinking about the last time I saw her smile," John said one Sunday in late March, staring at his hands. It was maybe 2 weeks before she died. She'd been so miserable, crying all the time, and then for just a moment she looked at me and smiled. Just this tiny smile, but it lit up her whole face. And I thought, she's going to be all right. She's going to survive this. I was wrong. "We were both wrong," Beatrice said quietly. "We thought we were saving her. We thought the money would be enough." "Was it worth it?" John asked suddenly, looking up at her with haunted eyes. "The money we're earning, the food we can afford now, was it worth Alina's life?" The question hung in the air between them, terrible and unanswerable. What could Beatrice say? That yes, it was worth it because they were surviving when so many others were dying. That no, it wasn't worth it, that she'd trade every penny and her own life to have Alina back. Both answers were true and false simultaneously. "I don't know," she finally whispered. "I don't know, John. I'll never know." They sat in silence after that, holding hands, two people bound together by love and loss, and a decision that could never be unmade. As April arrived and the weather began to warm slightly, Beatrice found herself watching Robert with complicated feelings. He was thriving, growing plump and healthy, hitting all the milestones that Alina had been reaching before everything fell apart. At 4 months old, he was starting to laugh, to reach for toys, to show the beginnings of personality. He was a sweet-tempered baby, easy to care for, and despite everything, Beatrice found herself caring about him. This felt like a betrayal. How could she care about this child when her own daughter lay cold in the ground? How could she feel affection for him when he'd essentially stolen the milk that should have kept Alina alive? But she couldn't help it. He was innocent, this small person who knew nothing of the circumstances surrounding his care. When he smiled at her, she smiled back. When he cried, she comforted him. When he nursed, she felt the same biological satisfaction she'd felt with Alina, the body's simple pleasure in providing what was needed. She was his wet nurse, yes, but she was also becoming something more. Not his mother. Lady Margaret maintained appropriate boundaries there, but a kind of secondary maternal figure, someone who met his needs and loved him despite herself. This realization came to her one evening in early May as she sat in the nursery rocking Robert to sleep after his evening feeding. The sun was setting outside the window, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and Robert's eyes were heavy, fighting sleep the way Bobby's do. His small hand gripped her finger, and she found herself singing to him, the same lullaby she'd sung to Alina. "Sleep, baby, sleep. Their father guards the sheep. Thy mother shakes the dreamland tree, and down falls a little dream for thee. Sleep, baby, sleep." Her voice cracked on the word mother, and tears began to fall, but she kept singing. Because Robert needed it, because the song wanted to be sung, because somehow, inexplicably, life continued even after it should have stopped. Lady Margaret found her like that, crying and singing and rocking her son, and for a moment neither woman spoke. Then Lady Margaret crossed the room and did something unexpected. She placed a hand on Beatrice's shoulder, a gesture of comfort from a noble lady to a peasant servant, breaking through the rigid class boundaries that usually kept them separate. "You're a good woman, Beatrice," Lady Margaret said softly. "And a good mother. What happened to your daughter? It wasn't your fault. This terrible famine, these impossible choices, none of it is your fault." "Then whose fault is it?" Beatrice asked, her voice raw. "Someone must be to blame. Someone must be responsible for a world where mothers have to choose which baby lives and which one dies." "God's, perhaps," Lady Margaret said. "Or no one's. I don't know. I don't have answers. I just know that you did what you thought was right, what you thought would save your family. And I know that my son is alive because of you. That matters. It doesn't erase your loss, but it matters." After Lady Margaret left, Beatrice sat with Robert until he was fully asleep, then laid him gently in his cradle. She stood watching him for a long moment, this child who lived because Alina had died, and tried to make peace with the unbearable complexity of it all. The next Sunday, John didn't come to visit. Beatrice waited in the manor gardens for an hour before finally asking one of the servants to inquire at the cottage. The servant returned with troubling news. John had been seen at the village alehouse the previous evening, drinking heavily, and hadn't been at work at the mill in 3 days. Beatrice's heart sank. John rarely drank, couldn't afford to drink, and certainly couldn't afford to miss work. This wasn't like him. Something was wrong. She received permission from Lady Margaret to visit the cottage outside her usual Sunday time, and what she found there frightened her. The small dwelling was in disarray, dishes unwashed, the fire burned down to embers, a sour smell suggesting John hadn't emptied the waste bucket in days. And John himself was lying on the bed they'd once shared, staring at the ceiling with empty eyes. "John," Beatrice approached cautiously. "John, what's happened? Are you ill?" "I couldn't do it anymore," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Couldn't go to the mill, couldn't pretend everything was normal, couldn't keep living in this cottage where Alina should be. I just couldn't." Beatrice sat beside him on the bed, touching his forehead to check for fever, but his skin was cool. This wasn't physical illness. This was the same soul sickness she felt, the same grief that sometimes made breathing feel like too much effort. "I know," she said softly. "I know it's hard. But John, you have to keep going. You have to eat, work, take care of yourself. For Alina's sake. For our sake." "Why?" he asked, finally turning to look at her. "What's the point? We sacrificed our daughter for money, and for what? So we could survive, so we could live with the guilt. I don't want this life, B. I don't want to survive if this is what survival means." She didn't have an answer for him, no words of wisdom that could make sense of their situation. She simply lay down beside him, holding him as he'd once held her, two broken people trying to figure out how to keep existing. Over the next several weeks, Beatrice found herself caught between two worlds. At the manor, she cared for Robert, watching him grow and develop, finding small moments of joy in his progress despite the grief that shadowed everything. In the cottage, she tried to help John pull himself out of the darkness that had claimed him, with mixed success. Some days he seemed better, managing to go to work to care for himself. Other days he couldn't get out of bed. The village began to whisper. Beatrice heard the gossip through the manor servants, how John Miller had gone strange after his daughter's death, how he was neglecting his duties, how he spent what little money he had on ale. Some said he was cursed, others said he was weak. Few showed much sympathy, everyone was struggling, everyone had losses, and wallowing in grief was a luxury no one could afford. In June, as her nursing contract was entering its final months, Beatrice received unexpected news. She was pregnant again. The realization came one morning when she woke feeling nauseated, a sensation she remembered from her pregnancy with Alina. She counted back and realized she must have conceived in April, during one of John's better periods when he'd seemed almost himself again, when they'd sought comfort in each other's arms. Her first emotion was terror. How could she bring another child into this world after what had happened to Alina? How could she trust herself to be a mother again after failing so catastrophically the first time? And practically speaking, what would this mean for her wet nursing contract? For the income they still desperately needed? She told Lady Margaret immediately, knowing the pregnancy would affect her milk supply eventually. The lady's reaction was measured. "How far along are you?" "Perhaps 2 months, I think." "Then you can likely continue nursing Robert for another few months before your milk changes significantly." By then he'll be 8 months old, ready to begin weaning onto pap and soft foods. The timing could be worse. Could be worse. That seemed to sum up Beatrice's entire life lately. Things could always be worse, even when they already seemed unbearable. She told John that evening, unsure how he'd react. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, then slowly pulled her into his arms. "A second chance," he whispered into her hair. "Maybe this is God giving us a second chance." "Or a second opportunity to fail," Beatrice said, voicing her deepest fear. "No," John pulled back to look at her face. "We won't fail this time. We'll do everything differently. You won't have to become a wet nurse. I'll find more work somehow, any work. We'll manage together, keep the baby with us. We won't make the same mistakes." Beatrice wanted to believe him, but experience had taught her that wanting something didn't make it happen. The famine was still ongoing, work was still scarce, and Bobby's required resources they didn't have. But she couldn't take away this small spark of hope she saw in John's eyes, the first real life she'd seen there in months. "We'll try," she agreed. "We'll do our best." The pregnancy brought changes. Beatrice's body, already stressed from producing milk while grieving, struggled with the additional demand of growing a baby. She became exhausted easily, needed more food, found herself dizzy and weak at times. Lady Margaret, to her credit, increased Beatrice's rations, ensuring she had enough nutrition to support both nursing and pregnancy. But it was still difficult, a constant balancing act that left Beatrice feeling depleted. Robert began the weaning process in July, as planned. At 7 months old, he was ready for soft foods, pap, mashed vegetables, bits of bread soaked in broth. He protested the change, preferring the comfort of nursing, but adapted quickly. Lady Margaret had hired another woman to take over Robert's daily care, allowing Beatrice to gradually reduce her nursing sessions. By August, Beatrice was only nursing Robert twice a day, morning and evening, and spending the rest of her time preparing for her own baby's arrival in late autumn. Lady Margaret fulfilled her contract obligations completely, paying Beatrice through the end of August even though her services were reduced. The final payment came with an unexpected addition, a small linen bag containing an extra shilling and a note in Lady Margaret's elegant handwriting. "For the child to come. May he or she fare better than your first. You have my gratitude for saving my son." The kindness of it undid something in Beatrice. She sat in her chamber at the manor, holding the bag of coins, and cried, not the bitter, angry tears she'd shed so often, but something softer, something that felt almost like healing. Lady Margaret hadn't had to do this. The contract was complete, the debt paid. This extra shilling was pure generosity, an acknowledgement of Beatrice's loss and sacrifice. She returned to the cottage at the end of August, moving back in with John, taking up her old life. It felt strange after 6 months at the manor. The cottage was so much smaller, colder, more primitive than what she'd grown accustomed to. But it was home, and John was there, and they would face what came next together. The village's reaction to her return was mixed. Some welcomed her, asking after her health and the coming baby. Others kept their distance, superstitious about the woman whose first child had died, worried that her bad fortune might be contagious. Beatrice learned to ignore the whispers, to focus on practical matters, preparing clothes for the baby, putting together a new cradle since they'd buried Alina with hers, gathering what supplies they could afford. John had managed to keep his position at the mill, though the hours were still reduced. The money Beatrice had earned as a wet nurse had given them a small cushion of savings, enough to get through the lean months before the baby came. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd had before Alina was born. Maybe this time would be different. In September, Beatrice visited the churchyard where Alina was buried. She'd been avoiding it since the funeral, unable to face the physical reality of her daughter's grave. But now, with new life growing inside her, she felt a need to make peace with the past before moving forward. The grave was marked with a simple wooden cross, Alina's name carved into it by John's unpracticed hand. Already the grass was growing over the mound of earth, nature reclaiming what it had given. Beatrice knelt beside it, placing her hand on the cool ground, feeling the dampness from recent rain. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I thought I was saving you. I thought the money would be enough. I was wrong, and you paid the price for my mistake. I'll never forgive myself for that." The grave offered no response, no absolution. But somehow, speaking the words aloud helped. She told Alina about the new baby coming, about how she and John were going to try again, do better. She promised that this new child wouldn't replace Alina, that Alina would always be loved, always be remembered, always be there first. "Your little brother or sister will know about you," Beatrice said. "We'll know that they had a sister who came before them, who taught us hard lessons about what matters most. You mattered, Alina. Your short life mattered. It changed everything." When she finally left the churchyard, Beatrice felt lighter somehow, as if speaking to Alina had released some of the weight she'd been carrying. The guilt remained, would always remain, but it felt more bearable now, integrated into who she was rather than consuming her entirely. October brought the first hard frosts, a reminder that another winter was coming. But this year, the harvest had been better than the previous 2 years. Not abundant, not enough to fully recover from the famine's devastation, but better. There was bread in the market again, though still expensive. Vegetables were more available. People were still hungry, still struggling, but the sharp edge of desperation had dulled slightly. "It's not over yet," John said as they walked through the market one Saturday, surveying the improved but still meager offerings. "But maybe the worst has passed. Maybe we can actually make it through this." Beatrice rested a hand on her swollen belly, feeling the baby kick. "Maybe," she agreed. "I want to believe that." Her labor began on a cold November evening, very similar to the night Alina had been born. But this time, Beatrice wasn't alone. John stayed with her throughout, and they'd arranged for Mistress Joan, the village healer, to attend the birth. They'd used some of their savings to ensure proper help would be there, learning from past mistakes. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Beatrice had forgotten how much it hurt, how exhausting it was, how your body felt like it was being torn apart. But Mistress Joan was skilled and patient, guiding her through it, telling her when to push and when to breathe, giving her herbs that eased the pain slightly. Finally, as the afternoon sun was setting, the baby emerged, a boy, red-faced and squalling, vigorously angry at being thrust into the cold world. Mistress Joan cleaned him and wrapped him in the linen cloth they'd prepared, then placed him in Beatrice's arms. "A healthy son," she pronounced. "Good side, strong lungs, all his fingers and toes. You've been blessed." Beatrice looked down at her son, this new person who resembled Eleanor in some ways, but was also distinctly himself. He had John's nose and her own fair coloring, and when he briefly opened his eyes, they were a startling blue that might darken to brown or might stay blue forever. "Thomas," she said, looking up at John. "For your father, we'll call him Thomas." "Thomas Miller," John repeated, touching his son's tiny hand with one rough finger. The baby immediately gripped it, that instinctive infant reflex, and John's eyes filled with tears. "Hello, Thomas. Welcome to the world." The first few weeks with Thomas were both wonderful and terrifying. He was a good baby, nursing well, sleeping in reasonable stretches, crying only when he had genuine needs. Every milestone he passed, 1 week old, 2 weeks, a month, felt like a small victory, a sign that maybe this time would be different, that they could actually raise a child successfully. But Beatrice found herself haunted by Eleanor's memory. Every time she nursed Thomas, she thought about the milk she'd denied her daughter. Every time she held him, she remembered holding Eleanor, watching her waste away. The guilt was always there, a shadow over every moment of joy with her son. John seemed better with Thomas's arrival. The darkness that had consumed him after Eleanor's death lifted somewhat, replaced by a fierce determination to be a good father to this child. He worked as much as the mill would allow, spent his free time improving their cottage, played with Thomas and talked to him as if the baby could understand every word. "You're going to be strong," John would tell his son, holding him up and examining him seriously. "Stronger than your father, smarter than your grandfather. You're going to survive this famine and everything else the world throws at you. You're a Miller, and we endure." Beatrice watched these interactions with bittersweet feelings. This was what Eleanor should have had: a father's love, a secure home, enough food, a real chance at life. But Eleanor hadn't had those things, had never had a fair chance, and the unfairness of it still cut deep. In December, a month after Thomas's birth, Beatrice received an unexpected visitor. Lady Margaret came to the cottage, bringing gifts: warm blankets for the baby, preserved fruits from the manor's stores, and a beautiful christening gown made of fine linen. "I heard you'd had a son," Lady Margaret said, admiring Thomas, who was sleeping peacefully in Beatrice's arms. He's beautiful, healthy, very healthy, praise God, Beatrice replied. Growing well, eating well, thriving. I'm glad. Lady Margaret hesitated, then continued. I want you to know that Robert is also thriving. He's walking now, getting into everything. He's a happy child, full of mischief and curiosity. You gave him that, the strong foundation he needed. I'll always be grateful. The words were kind, but they still stung. Robert was thriving. Eleanor had died. The inequality of it remained painful even now. Lady Margaret seemed to sense this. I know it's not fair, she said quietly. I know your loss and my gain are connected in a way that makes gratitude complicated. But I want you to know that I think of your daughter. I pray for her soul. And I hope that someday you can find peace with what happened. After she left, Beatrice sat for a long time with Thomas in her arms, thinking about fairness, about gratitude, about the impossibly complex web of obligations and emotions that connected her to Lady Margaret and Robert. She didn't know if she'd ever find peace with Eleanor's death. But maybe peace wasn't the goal. Maybe it was enough to simply continue living, continue loving, continue trying to do better. Christmas that year was quiet but meaningful. They had enough food for a modest celebration: roasted chicken, fresh bread, even a small amount of honey to sweeten their pottage. Thomas was 6 weeks old, past the most dangerous period of infancy, gaining weight steadily. John had received a small bonus from the mill owner, grateful that John had stuck with the work even during the hardest times. They had survived another year. As they sat together by the fire on Christmas Eve, Thomas sleeping in his cradle and the cottage warmer than it had been in years, John raised a cup of ale in a toast. To Eleanor, he said quietly, who we will never forget, and to Thomas, who gives us hope for the future, and to us for surviving when so many didn't. To Eleanor, Beatrice echoed, tears sliding down her face. And to second chances. They drank and held each other, and listened to their son's peaceful breathing, and tried to believe that the worst was behind them. The winter of 1317 was still difficult. Food was expensive, work was scarce, cold was a constant enemy. But it was better than the previous winters. The famine was slowly releasing its grip, and though it would take years for full recovery, there were signs of improvement. Spring planting went better. Fewer people died. The village began to feel less like a graveyard and more like a place where life could continue. Thomas thrived through it all. By his first birthday, he was a robust toddler, walking and babbling and showing all the signs of healthy development. Beatrice still watched him with the anxious vigilance of a mother who'd lost a child, never quite able to relax into confidence that he'd survive. But he did survive, day after day, growing stronger. She returned to work when Thomas was weaned, not as a wet nurse. She'd sworn never to do that again, but to help Mistress Joan with her healing work. Beatrice had learned much from her mother about herbs and remedies, and Mistress Joan was growing older, needed assistance. It wasn't lucrative work, but it brought in enough to help, and it felt meaningful in a way wet nursing never had. She was helping people, yes, but on her own terms without sacrificing her own children. John advanced at the mill, eventually becoming the head miller when old Master Robert died. It came with better pay and more stability, enough that they could actually save money, build a cushion against future hardship. They never became wealthy. Wealth was always out of reach for people of their class, but they achieved a modest security that felt like riches after years of desperation. Over time, they had more children. Another son, William, born in 1319. A daughter, Agnes, in 1321. Each pregnancy was terrifying, each birth a battle with fear, each child's survival a miracle Beatrice never took for granted. She was a nervous mother, perhaps overprotective, haunted by the memory of Eleanor. But she was also a loving mother, determined to give her children everything she'd been unable to give her firstborn. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who seemed to understand, even without being told directly, that he carried the weight of being a replacement child, a second chance. When he was old enough to understand, Beatrice told him about Eleanor, about the sister he'd never known, about the circumstances of her death. She wanted him to understand the choices she'd made, the prices they'd paid, the complexity of survival in harsh times. Was it wrong? Thomas asked when he was perhaps 10 years old enough to grasp moral complexity. What you did, nursing the noble baby instead of Eleanor. Beatrice had thought about this question for 10 years, turning it over in her mind countless times, and she still didn't have a definitive answer. I don't know, she told him honestly. I thought I was doing the right thing, choosing survival over everything else. But Eleanor died anyway, so maybe it was wrong. Or maybe she would have died either way, and at least my choice meant you and your siblings got to be born and got to have better chances than she did. I'll never know for certain. Do you regret it? Thomas pressed. Every day of my life, Beatrice said quietly. But regret doesn't undo what's done. It just teaches us to make different choices going forward. And I've learned, Thomas. With you, with William, with Agnes, I've learned what matters most isn't money or security or even survival at any cost. It's love. It's being there. It's choosing your children over everything else, even when that choice is hard. Thomas absorbed this seriously, the way he absorbed everything. I'll remember that, he said. When I have children someday, I'll remember. Years passed as they always do. The Great Famine officially ended in 1322, 7 years after it began, though its effects lingered much longer. The population of England had been devastated, villages abandoned, families destroyed. But slowly, painfully, life recovered. Fields were planted again, animals are bred. Children were born. The world continued its eternal cycle of death and renewal. Beatrice and John grew older together, their marriage strengthened by shared tragedy and survival. They never spoke much about Eleanor. The pain was too great, but she was always there between them, a ghost that shaped how they loved their other children, how they made their choices, how they understood the precariousness of life. When Thomas was 16, he apprenticed at the mill with his father, learning the trade that would support his own family someday. William showed an aptitude for numbers and eventually became a clerk for one of the local merchants. Agnes, fierce and independent, married a prosperous farmer and ran his household with an efficiency that reminded everyone of her mother. Beatrice continued her healing work, becoming known throughout the region as a skilled herbalist and midwife. She helped dozens of women through childbirth, saved countless bobbies, used everything she'd learned from her own tragic experience to help others avoid similar fates. It was her way of making meaning from Eleanor's death, turning pain into purpose, loss into legacy. In 1340, when Beatrice was 47 years old and starting to feel the weight of age, she received word that Lady Margaret had died. She'd lived to see her son Robert grow to adulthood, marry, produce heirs of his own. The wet nursing arrangement that had dominated Beatrice's life for half a year more than 20 years ago had been just one small incident in Lady Margaret's long life, but it had shaped everything about Beatrice's existence since. Beatrice attended the funeral, standing at the back of the church with other common folk while the nobility mourned in the front. She watched Robert Thornbury, now Sir Robert, lord of the manor, as he stood beside his father, grief evident on his face. He was tall and strong, with an air of authority that came naturally to those born to privilege. He'd survived, thrived, lived the life his mother had hired Beatrice to ensure. After the service, as people filed out, Sir Robert noticed Beatrice. He approached her and she curtsied, uncertain what he wanted. "You're Beatrice Miller," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, my lord. My wet nurse. My mother spoke of you sometimes, saying you saved my life." He paused, seeming to struggle with something. "She also told me about your daughter, the one who died while you were caring for me. I'm sorry for that. I know my life came at a terrible cost to you." Beatrice was surprised he knew, surprised he cared. "It wasn't your fault, my lord. You were just a baby." "Perhaps. But I've benefited from your sacrifice my entire life. That creates a debt." He pressed something into her hand, a small purse heavy with coins. "This won't bring back what you lost. Nothing can, but I wanted you to have it. My mother would have wanted it too." After he left, Beatrice opened the purse and found more money than she'd seen in years, enough to secure her old age, help her children, maybe even have some comforts she'd never been able to afford. It felt strange, being compensated so belatedly for a loss that could never truly be compensated. But it was also a kind of acknowledgement, a recognition that Eleanor's death had mattered and had meant something beyond just being another casualty of a cruel time. She used some of the money to commission a proper stone marker for Eleanor's grave, replacing the wooden cross that had long since rotted away. She had the mason carve her daughter's name and dates, along with a simple inscription: "Eleanor Miller, beloved daughter. Gone too soon, but never forgotten." John wept when he saw it, the first tears he'd shed for Eleanor in years. They stood together in the churchyard, holding hands, remembering the tiny girl who'd lived for such a short time but had changed their lives forever. "Do you think she knows?" John asked quietly. "That we never forgot her. That we've thought about her every day since she died." "I hope so," Beatrice said. "I have to believe that somehow, somewhere, she knows she was loved. That's all any of us want, really. To know that we mattered, that our lives had meaning, that someone loved us." They visited Alina's grave regularly after that, always together, always in quiet communion with the daughter they'd lost and the choices they'd made. And slowly, over the years, the crushing guilt began to transform into something else. Not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance. An understanding that they'd done their best in impossible circumstances. That love sometimes meant making choices with no good options. That survival could require sacrifices that broke your heart, even as they saved your life. Beatrice lived to be 63 years old, which was remarkably old for a woman of her time and class. She died peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1356, 40 years after that terrible winter, when she'd made the choice that would define her life. Her children and grandchildren surrounded her bed in her final days, and she used those last hours to tell them stories about their grandfather John, about the Great Famine, about the choices people made to survive. And she told them about Alina, about the sister and aunt they'd never known, about the baby girl who died so others might live. She wanted them to remember that life was precious, that every choice had consequences, that love sometimes meant sacrifice, and that even our worst mistakes could teach us how to live better. "Don't judge me too harshly," she told Thomas on her last day, her voice weak but her eyes still clear. "I did what I thought was right. It wasn't enough, but it was all I had to give." "I don't judge you at all, Mother," Thomas said, holding her aged hand in his strong one. "You survived. You loved us. You taught us what matters. That's more than enough." She smiled at that, satisfied. Then she closed her eyes and slipped away, finally going to wherever it was that Alina had gone 40 years before. They buried Beatrice beside Alina, reuniting mother and daughter at last. The entire village came to the funeral. The children she'd helped birth, the people she'd healed, the families whose lives she'd touched. Thomas spoke at the graveside, telling everyone assembled about his mother's strength, her resilience, her capacity for love even after devastating loss. "She made hard choices," he said. "Choices that cost her dearly. But she never let those choices destroy her. She took her grief and guilt and turned them into compassion for others. She spent her life helping people, healing people, making sure others didn't have to suffer the way she had suffered. That's her legacy, not the mistakes she made, but what she did with them afterward. How she transformed pain into purpose. And in the years and generations that followed, Beatrice's story was told and retold, changing slightly with each telling but keeping its essential truth. She became a cautionary tale about the cost of survival, yes, but also an inspiring story about resilience, about continuing to love even after your heart has been broken, about finding meaning in tragedy. Some remembered her as the wet nurse who let her own baby die, a dark story about impossible choices and cruel economics. But her family remembered her differently, as a woman who'd survived the Great Famine, raised children against incredible odds, and devoted her life to helping others avoid the tragedies she'd endured. Both versions were true. Both versions were incomplete. The full truth was more complex than any simple story could capture. Beatrice had been neither villain nor saint, neither completely wrong nor entirely right. She'd been human, flawed, struggling, doing her best in circumstances designed to break her. She'd failed in some way and succeeded in others. She'd lost one child but saved others. She'd made choices she regretted, but learned from those choices. She'd lived a life that mattered, even when it was marked by tragedy. And Alina, the daughter who died so young, remained part of that story, not as a footnote but as a central figure whose brief life had ripple effects that lasted generations. The stone marker Beatrice had commissioned stood in the churchyard for centuries, weathering but enduring, a permanent reminder that this child had existed, had been loved, had mattered. In the end, that was what both of them, Beatrice and Alina, had wanted: not to be forgotten, not to have their struggles dismissed as merely another sad story from a cruel time, but to be remembered as real people who'd lived and loved and suffered and endured, whose story, however painful, was worth telling. And now, dear friend, as you drift toward sleep, carry with you not the darkness of this tale but its light, the truth that even in our hardest moments, even when we make choices we'll regret forever, we can still find ways to love, to heal, to matter. That our mistakes don't define us unless we let them, that grief can coexist with joy, that life insists on continuing even after our hearts have broken. May you rest peacefully, knowing that the human capacity for resilience is greater than any tragedy, that love endures even through impossible circumstances, and that every life, no matter how brief or how marked by sorrow, has inherent worth and meaning. Sleep well, and let the story of Beatrice and Alina remind you that survival is not just about enduring, but about what we choose to do with the life we've fought so hard to keep. In the morning, may you wake refreshed, carrying forward the lessons of compassion, forgiveness, and the understanding that we are all doing our best in a world that sometimes asks more of us than seems humanly possible. In the decades after Beatrice's death, her story took on a life of its own in the village of Ashford and the surrounding countryside. It became one of those tales that mothers told daughters, that elders shared by firelight, that priests referenced in sermons about the nature of sacrifice and redemption. But as with all stories passed down through generations, it changed in the telling, taking on different meanings for different people in different times. Thomas Miller, Beatrice's eldest son, lived to be 72 years old, dying in 1388 during the reign of Richard II. He became a prosperous miller, eventually owning the mill outright, and raised 6 children of his own. Throughout his life, he kept his mother's memory alive, ensuring that his children and grandchildren knew the full story, not a sanitized version, but the complicated truth of what had happened during the Great Famine. He commissioned a second stone marker, this one placed at the entrance to the mill, that read, "In memory of Eleanor Miller, 1315-1316, and Beatrice Miller, 1290-31356. May their story teach us that love sometimes means impossible choices, and grace means learning to live with them." The marker became a landmark in the village, a place where people would pause and remember, where young mothers would stop with their bobbies and offer quiet prayers of gratitude that they lived in easier times. Because by the late 14th century, England had recovered from the famine, though new challenges had emerged: the Black Death, the 100 Years' War, social upheaval. But food was more abundant, and the particular horror of watching children starve had faded into memory. William Miller, the second son, became a scholar of sorts, unusual for someone of his class. He learned to read and write fluently, and in his later years, he wrote down his mother's story as she had told it to him, creating one of the few written records of ordinary people's experiences during the Great Famine. His account, written in Middle English on precious parchment, included this passage: "My mother Beatrice was a woman of great strength and great sorrow. She died what she thought was right, to save us all from hunger and death. But the cost was to hire first child, my sister Eleanor, whom I never knew. All her life she carried this burden, and yet she rose each day and loved us and served others. If there be saints among the common folk, my mother was one, not for perfection but for enduring what would have destroyed a lesser soul." This manuscript survived through the centuries, passing through various hands, eventually ending up in a monastery library, where it was preserved along with other documents from the period. Modern historians would later discover it and recognize its value, a first-hand account of the human cost of the Great Famine, told not from the perspective of nobles or clergy, but from ordinary people who'd lived through it. Agnes Miller, the daughter born in 1321, carried her mother's legacy forward in a different way. She became a midwife like Beatrice, but she also became an advocate for mothers and children, using her position in her husband's prosperous household to establish what would today be called charitable works. She created a fund to help women who needed wet nurses, ensuring they received fair payment and that their own children were provided for during the nursing period. She also established a small almshouse where destitute mothers could stay during their lying-in period, ensuring they had proper care and nutrition. "My mother's mistake," Agnes would say, "was being forced to choose between her children and survival. No woman should have to make that choice. If we have the means to help, we must." Her charitable works continued long after her death, funded by endowments she'd established. For generations, the Agnes Miller House provided shelter and care for mothers in need, a living monument to the lesson Beatrice's tragedy had taught, that communities had obligations to their most vulnerable members, that preventing tragedies was better than mourning them afterward. The story of Beatrice and Eleanor also became entwined with the history of wet nursing itself. In the generations following the Great Famine, as prosperity gradually returned to England, the practice of wet nursing underwent changes. Guilds of wet nurses formed in larger towns and cities, establishing standards and protections. Contracts began to include provisions for the wet nurses' own children, ensuring they would be fed and cared for during the nursing period. The price of wet nursing services increased, reflecting greater recognition of what was being asked of these women. This wasn't because of Beatrice's story alone. Of course, social change is never that simple. But her story, as it circulated and was retold, contributed to a shifting understanding of the moral dimensions of the practice. It became harder to ignore the human cost when people could point to a specific example, a real woman and child whose names they knew, whose tragedy they could imagine. In the village church of Ashford, a tradition developed. Every year on the anniversary of Eleanor's death, March 15th, the priest would say a special mass for all children who'd died young, and for all mothers who'd had to make impossible choices. The church would be filled with women, many of them holding their own babies, many of them crying quietly for losses of their own. It became a day of communal mourning and mutual support, when the village acknowledged that tragedies like Eleanor's were not isolated incidents, but part of the fabric of medieval life. Father William, who served as priest in Ashford from 1360 to 1395, wrote in his journal about these memorial masses. When we remember Eleanor Miller, we remember all the children lost to famine, plague, and poverty. And when we remember Beatrice Miller, we remember all the mothers who have borne unbearable burdens. In remembering, we honor them. In honoring them, we commit ourselves to building a world where such tragedies become less common. This is holy work. The story also found its way into art and literature. A traveling minstrel named Geoffrey composed a ballad called The Wet Nurse's Lament that became popular in the southern counties of England during the late 14th century. It told a dramatized version of Beatrice's story, with some embellishments and simplifications typical of folk ballads, but it captured the emotional core. A mother's anguish at having to choose between children, the guilt that haunted her afterward, and ultimately, her redemption through a life of service to others. The final verse went, "So mothers fair, when choices hard do come your way, remember she who chose and grieved until her dying day. But know that love can heal what sorrow tears apart, and broken souls can mend and still possess a loving heart." For Beatrice the nurse, though she did lose her own, saved countless other children, her compassion fully shown. The ballad wasn't historically accurate in all details, and it simplified the moral complexity of Beatrice's situation, but it served a purpose. It made people think about the lives of common women, about the sacrifices that were hidden behind the survival of noble families, about the human cost of social and economic inequality. In the manor house, the Thornbury family maintained their own tradition regarding the story. Sir Robert Thornbury, the baby Beatrice had nursed, lived until 1370, dying at age 54. Before his death, he established an endowment for the church in Ashford, specifically requesting that prayers be said annually for Beatrice Miller and her daughter Eleanor, to whom my family owes an unpayable debt. His son, also named William, expanded this bequest, establishing a scholarship fund that would pay for the education of one promising child from Ashford each year, preference given to children from the poorest families. In the document establishing the fund, he wrote, "My grandmother, Lady Margaret, purchased my father's life with coins. My father recognized this debt and sought to honor it. I now extend that honor by investing in the futures of children who, like Eleanor Miller, deserve chances they might not otherwise receive." This scholarship continued for generations, educating dozens of children who might otherwise have remained illiterate peasants. Some became clerks, some became craftsmen. One eventually became a priest. All of them were told about Eleanor Miller and Beatrice Miller, about why the scholarship existed, about the idea that privilege created obligations to those less fortunate. The story's reach extended beyond Ashford. As England's economy recovered and then flourished in the later medieval period, questions about labor, compensation, and the rights of workers became increasingly prominent. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 challenged assumptions about social hierarchy. The growth of towns and trade created new economic opportunities. And in this changing context, stories like Beatrice's, stories about the hidden costs that ordinary people paid to maintain the privileges of the wealthy, took on new political dimensions. A pamphleteer in London in 1395, arguing for fair wages and better treatment of workers, referenced the wet nurse of Ashford who lost her daughter while feeding a lord's son, using it as an example of how the nobility literally thrived on the sacrifices of the poor. This wasn't necessarily how Beatrice herself would have understood her story. She'd seen it as a personal tragedy, not a political statement. But stories take on lives of their own, meanings beyond what their original participants intended. Yet through all these retellings and reinterpretations, certain core truths remained constant. Beatrice had been a real woman who'd faced an impossible choice. Eleanor had been a real baby who died too young. The love between mother and daughter had been real, as had been the grief, the guilt, and the eventual hard-won peace. These human realities transcended political interpretations and moral debates. They remained simply, powerfully true. In the churchyard at Ashford, the two graves, Eleanor's with its stone marker, Beatrice's beside it, became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking comfort in their own grief. Women who'd lost children would come and kneel beside Eleanor's stone, finding solace in knowing others had suffered similar losses and survived. People facing impossible choices would visit and pray for wisdom, for strength, for the courage to live with whatever decision they made. An elderly woman named Marjorie, visiting the graves in 1410, told the priest, "I lost 3 children to the plague 15 years ago. For a long time, I thought I couldn't go on. But then I heard the story of Beatrice Miller, how she lost her daughter and yet found ways to keep living, keep loving, keep helping others. If she could survive her grief, I thought, perhaps I could too. These graves remind me that sorrow is part of life, but it doesn't have to be the end of life. This was perhaps the most important legacy of Beatrice's story, not the specific details of wet nursing or famine, but the broader truth about human resilience. That we can endure terrible things and still find reasons to continue. That guilt and love can coexist. That our worst moments don't define our entire lives. That redemption is possible, not through erasing our mistakes, but through what we do afterward. As the medieval period gave way to the early modern era, as England transformed through the Reformation, the Renaissance, and the Age of Exploration, the specifics of Beatrice's story began to fade. The Great Famine became a historical footnote. The practice of wet nursing continued but changed. The Thornbury family line eventually died out. The village of Ashford grew and changed, its medieval past becoming increasingly distant. But the graves remained, and the essential story remained, passed down through generations with varying degrees of accuracy, but constant emotional truth. By the 17th century, local historians were writing about the wet nurse of Ashford as a notable figure from the village's past, though details had become fuzzy. By the 18th century, folklorists were collecting versions of the story, recognizing it as an important example of folk memory and moral teaching. In 1756, exactly 440 years after Aliner's death, a scholar named Edmund Hartley published a book titled Tales of Medieval Kent, which included a chapter on Beatrice and Aliner. He'd researched church records, found William Miller's manuscript, interviewed descendants of the Miller family, and pieced together the most accurate account written up to that point. In his introduction to the chapter, Hartley wrote, "This story of a wet nurse and her lost child might seem a minor footnote to history, barely worth recording when set against wars and kings and great events. But I would argue the opposite. The great events of history were built on countless small tragedies like this one, countless individual sacrifices that enabled the survival and prosperity of the powerful. In remembering Beatrice Miller and Aliner Miller, we remember all those whose names history forgot, whose struggles made possible everything that came after." Modern historians would later recognize Hartley's work as pioneering social history, an early attempt to recover the lives and experiences of ordinary people rather than focusing exclusively on elites. Beatrice's story became a case study, referenced in academic papers, included in textbooks about medieval daily life, cited as evidence of the human impact of the Great Famine. But beyond its historical significance, the story continued to resonate emotionally with readers across centuries. A mother in Victorian England, reading about Beatrice while nursing her own baby, would feel a shock of recognition at the dilemmas facing mothers across time. A social worker in the 20th century, working with families in poverty, would see parallels to modern impossible choices between income and childcare. A woman in the 21st century, struggling to balance career and family, would recognize the eternal tension between different obligations, different loves, different needs. The universality of Beatrice's story, the fact that it spoke to something timeless about motherhood, sacrifice, and the impossible calculus of love, ensured its survival across centuries. It wasn't just a historical curiosity, but a living story that each generation could relate to their own circumstances and challenges. In the churchyard at Ashford, now surrounded by a town that bears little resemblance to the medieval village where Beatrice lived, the two graves still stand. The stones are worn by weather and time, the inscriptions barely legible without careful examination. But they're maintained by the local historical society, preserved as reminders of the past. Occasionally, visitors come, students researching medieval history, genealogists tracing family trees, or simply curious people who have heard the story and wanted to pay their respects. On March 15th each year, a small ceremony still takes place, though its religious character has been replaced by something more secular, a moment of remembrance for children lost and parents grieving, for impossible choices made in difficult times, for the resilience of the human spirit in the face of tragedy. An inscription, added to the churchyard's memorial wall in 1956 on the 640th anniversary of Eleanor's death, reads, Eleanor Miller, 1315-1316, and Beatrice Miller, 1290-31356. Their story reminds us that every era has its struggles, every parent has its fears, every choice has its consequences. May we learn from their example to face our own challenges with courage, to forgive ourselves our failures, and to never forget that every life, however brief, has profound meaning. And now, dear friend, as this long story draws to its close, I leave you with the lessons that Beatrice herself learned through her suffering and survival. That love is complicated, requiring not grand gestures but daily choices, often in circumstances we wouldn't wish on anyone. That guilt is part of being human, especially for parents, and while we may never fully absolve ourselves, we can learn to carry our regrets without being crushed by them. That tragedy doesn't mean the end of joy. That loss doesn't preclude love. That we can be broken and still be whole in the ways that matter most. Beatrice made a choice that cost her dearly. She lived with the consequences of that choice for the rest of her life. But she also chose, every day thereafter, to keep living, keep loving, keep helping others. She transformed her private grief into public service, her personal tragedy into communal wisdom. She showed that redemption isn't about erasing our mistakes, but about what we build on top of them. And Eleanor, who lived such a brief life, mattered profoundly, not despite her short time on earth, but because of how her existence and loss shaped everyone who knew her. She taught her parents lessons about love and priority that they carried forward to their other children. She sparked conversations about economic justice and social responsibility that echoed through generations. She became, in memory, a symbol of all children deserving protection, care, and the chance to thrive. Their story, painful as it is, ultimately speaks to hope, the hope that we can survive our darkest moments, that communities can learn from tragedies to prevent future ones, that human connection and compassion can transcend even death, and that remembering those we've lost is a way of keeping them alive, of ensuring their brief time mattered, of honoring the love that persists long after its object is gone. So sleep now, dear friend, carrying with you not the sorrow of this tale but its deeper truths. Tomorrow, when you wake, you'll face your own challenges, your own choices, your own balancing acts between competing goods. May you face them with Beatrice's courage and resilience. May you love as fiercely as she did, even when love means sacrifice. May you forgive yourself the way she slowly learned to forgive herself. And may you remember that your story, like hers, matters, not because it's perfect or without tragedy, but because it's yours, because you lived it with as much grace as you could muster, because you kept going even when stopping seemed easier. Rest peacefully in the knowledge that the human capacity for endurance is vast, that love outlasts even death, that our mistakes don't define us unless we let them, and that every new day brings another chance to choose wisely, love fully, and live meaningfully. May Beatrice and Alina rest in peace, their story told, their struggles honored, their legacy of resilience and love carried forward through the centuries by all who hear their tale and recognize in it something true about the human condition, our fragility and our strength, our capacity for both terrible mistakes and beautiful redemption. Good night, dear friend. Sleep well and may your dreams be gentle. The end.